All right, Leviticus. How many of you got through the whole thing? It's okay to admit if you didn't. Some skimming. Some skimming, yeah. So, as a whole, Leviticus is written by the priests of Israel, but perhaps two different priestly groups. And through it all is the main point of Leviticus is God is holy. Created beings like us are not. We've got flaws, failures, sins, or whatnot. Come on in, Barb. Welcome. And because of that, how can we do our part, our best part, to be pure and holy like God is holy? So what can we do to achieve holiness, to achieve purity? And more important, I think, than maybe anything else, as we're thinking about it in an American context, which is not the same as the, pre-Christ, thousands of years before Jesus, biblical Hebrew people, is if you think of one bad apple spoils the bunch, that saying. The idea that if somebody in the camp does something that is sinful, it can spread like a virus. So keeping the community whole and pure is the goal of the priests. All right. I say it's written maybe in two different priestly voices because some of them are going to identify from the notes, maybe you picked this up, that the tabernacle, and we're talking about, when I say tabernacle, just really simple, they're carrying the Ark of the Covenant and some of its contents, and with it the presence of God in the community in a tent that is a fancy tent that they're going to call the tabernacle. All right, so some of them are going to say this is the holiest place and everything holy comes and goes through there. The others are going to say, hey, God promised us the land, and the land is our connection to what is holy, where our feet trod. If you remember, you hear some of this language that God gives to Abraham. Everywhere your feet carry you, I'm going to bless, and it's going to be yours. So everywhere that they go is blessed by God and holy and sanctified. So how do they keep the land that they've been promised by God holy? All right? So far, so good? Great, because it's going to go down here from here. All right. You have many different kinds of offerings, right? You've got burnt offerings. You've got sin and guilt offerings. You've got grain offerings, wave offerings. So some of those offerings, I'm not going to go through each one, but some of them are for things that you did unintentionally, unknowingly. So you're going to give a offering to God. And then some of those things you knew, all right, I know I stole some cookies from the cookie jar. I know I spoke badly about this person. I know I stole my neighbor's sheep. Those are intentional sin offerings, and you're going to have to give that thing back to God. Now, let's talk a little bit about sacrificial offering system. Why would, in your thought process, as you're trying to process, we're not sacrificing goats or cows or heifers or anything like that today. At least I don't think you are. Maybe you are.
Bulls without flaw.
Bulls without crushed testes. Yeah, that's important. We'll talk about that in a minute. But no blemishes on these things. Why all this language, do you think, about firstborn, lamb, animal that hasn't been ridden or yoked, and that its blood has to be let for your sins? All right, what do you take? What did you think of that? What are we talking about here? Anybody have any thoughts, concerns, puzzlement, questions around this? Because this is going to be important. Not only to Leviticus, but to a lot of our Christian hymn and language later. You say, what? Yes, it will be. So, confusion, clarity, what'd you make of it?
I thought it was designed to create some stakes. Something of value had to be at stake to make it more likely that the people would follow it, or they'd have an impact if they didn't follow it.
Yeah.
And so these are the most important things in their life, food and so on. So it was used as a way to persuade them
Yeah.
that this was of value.
Look at consequence in this.
Yeah.
Yeah, if I've got to give up the only steer, or it's not steer because that's tampered with. So if I got to give up my only bull because I've done a big wrong to my neighbor, my family might not eat or be able to work or be able to produce more cattle because I've done something wrong. So it's going to, my sin is going to, I'm going to feel it. As a way of also saying I'm sorry back to God. There's going to be a real detriment to my own well-being until even after I make this right. So there's a consequence to sin. It doesn't go unpunished. Mm-hmm. Lynn, you were going to say something too, or are you going to say the same thing?
No, I thought it was interesting, this is the first time that it hit me, is that, no, you can't eat the blood, you can't drink the blood, and yet now communion is in the blood.
Aha. Aha. All right, we're jumping the gun a little bit. We're going to hold that thought for just one more second. Blood. We're letting blood loose, but we're being very careful about it. We're not drinking it. We are very careful about where the blood goes. So blood is both life, but it also signifies death. And so the blood of the sacrifice signifies that God has blessed life, but we're also in danger of cursing life or of our sin is threatening life in some way. So we sacrifice something that is meaningful to us, and its blood, its gift of giving its life, is paying or atonement or the sacrifice of sorrow to God, saying, this is something that was mine. I'm giving it back to you to say I'm sorry. And by its blood, I'm asking you to forgive me. Basically. Okay? Everybody with me so far? All right, so why would it have ramifications to us today? Lynn alluded to it.
The Lamb of God.
Oh, we have in the Gospel of John, which we haven't read yet, John the Baptist is standing on the seashore. He says, behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. Well, that's not just something he made up on the fly as he's washing his shoes on the river. He is saying, we know what it is to sacrifice lambs, not only for sin offerings, but you remember that Exodus story we talked about, that 10th plague, the lamb, its blood's going on the doorpost of the Hebrew households so that the angel of death will pass over, sparing their lives and giving them a pathway to freedom. By the blood of the Lamb, they are protected by God. They're saved by God. So John's taking that same language from Jewish roots as a Jewish community and saying, here is the Lamb, which is God's Son. A theological statement about the cross. I think that's really important. A theological interpretation. Rome has crucified him. He's bloody. He's broken. But that is going to translate as at-one-ment or atonement for us for sins. I say that's important as a theological understanding of the cross, because that's not why Jesus was killed by the powers that be. They weren't atoning for anything. They wanted Jesus dead because he's agitating the status quo and threatening their sources of power. And we kill him. So, practical, theological lens. Two different things. We get that in a lot of our hymns too. So a lot of our hymns will say, by his blood, we are washed by his blood. But we're not Jewish, and that's not a supersessionist statement, but we didn't grow up in a synagogue. Even today, most Jewish people don't sacrifice animals as sin offerings or grain offerings, except if you're in ultra Orthodox communities. And so this idea of sacrifice ends at the destruction of the Second Temple, period. The idea of giving a blood sacrifice or sacrificing animals stops there, basically, in history. All right, so, okay, I'm talking too much.
So
Yes.
part of what Michelle talked about last week was, well, you gotta remember that the priests had to eat.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I had to, that threw me, not threw me, I'm like, wow, okay? So they're gonna write all this about sacrificing animals just so they can get a free meal.
So let's talk about that. Thank you. Thank you for bringing that up, Mark. So the priests write this code. And I remember when I was in seminary, one of my seminary buddies saying, hey, this sounds like the priests just grabbing power. Everything goes through the priests. Nobody gets off the hook without the priests, so they create their own job description. They get some of the choice cuts of the sacrifices, and they get their cut every time. And they're the only ones who have the power to, I mean, they play a little bit of doctor at one point. You know, they're looking at like leprous diseases and things. But they're also, so they take some risk on there, but they're also the only one who can proclaim this person's clean. This person can come back to the community. Which again is another thing where if you look at the New Testament, 10 lepers come to Jesus. For Jesus to have been a rabbi of appropriate social mores, he would have told them, don't come to me, go to the priests. They got to check you out. Jesus doesn't do that. Jesus says, your faith has made you well. Go tell the priests what happened here. In other words, here's the priests. Then go tell them. The priests probably weren't too happy about that. Jesus saying, you don't have to go to the priests. God's going to heal you because God's going to heal you in this moment. Kind of bucking the system in a way that probably didn't make the priests too happy. So anyway, yes, there's that idea that some of Leviticus could be taken from a more shadow interpretation of, it sounds like an awful lot of control consolidated into one class of society. And that's a legitimate critique. Because the priests, on a lot of levels, you'll see some of the things that the priests will write in the Holiness Code seem out of step with what the people are actually doing. All right, so yes, there is that. Other questions or thoughts before we dive into the actual book a little bit itself?
Something that struck me
Yeah.
was the whole resting on the Sabbath.
Mm-hmm.
That was driven home. And I just thought it was kind of ironic that, you know, all these other things like the sacrifices and some of those things, it's like culturally and the time or whatever, those things, it makes sense that they're not a part of our daily lives today because there's for so many reasons. And, you know, the growing of the hair is only the really Orthodox people or whatever. But I think back to like even the 1600s and colonial America, it was still a really big deal to not work on Sundays and to observe that.
Yeah.
So it struck me that something that was really pounded, I felt like that was pounded more than almost anything else, that's something that has so much fallen in our culture by the wayside, especially given that there is value to rest, you know, whether it be like the land for, you know, changing up the, you know, land for farming or whatever, and for people, obviously people don't get enough rest, and, you know, just all the reasons that would be good. It struck me that was something that still kind of would be useful today, that, you know, but I was surprised at how much it was in there. I don't ever remember that being nearly as big of a
Yeah.
part. I guess I never read Leviticus before, so, but I felt, it struck me that kept coming up.
Yeah. And what if I were to tell you one of the key pillars of Christianity comes out of Leviticus? I mean, absolutely key. Would you be stunned? Love thy neighbor
Yeah, love your neighbor.
as you love yourself.
Yeah, the commandments.
It was right there.
One of the two golden rules Jesus quotes, one comes from Leviticus, one comes from Deuteronomy. But this idea that you will treat others as you would want to be treated comes from this text. And the other thing that I think is really powerful, yes, the resting piece, there are things about Leviticus that are really pretty strong in that Leviticus sets up a system of economic equality on two levels. Do any of you remember any of those laws as you're wading through all this stuff, that you hear things that sound like, whoa, that doesn't sound like such a bad thing? Anybody?
Everybody gets it back again.
Right,
Yeah, after-
Jubilee.
Yeah, after
Mhm.
a certain amount of time,
Yeah.
everyone's restored to their original land. No interest on anything that's shared with your neighbor.
Yeah. So
And if they don't have the ability to pay, there was things about that as well.
yeah. So in Leviticus, if you borrow a cloak as collateral, an outer garment, you have to, if the person's poor, you have to give it back to them before nightfall so they have something to sleep in to keep warm. If you are gleaning if you're harvesting your grape vineyard or your orchard, you can only go through one time. Everything that's not ripe yet, you leave for those who are foreigners amongst you and who are orphaned and who are widowed and who are destitute. And they are allowed to take whatever's left. You're supposed to leave it for them. So built into this idea, and again, that's going to be a little unusual because if Leviticus is written by Moses, we're on the road. We're traveling through the wilderness. So is anybody owning vineyards or orchards or farms? No, we're traveling. Another clue as to why this text is written later.
Plaster houses too.
Yeah, you got your houses that are going to be inspected and your furniture. Yeah, you're not having time to, thank you. Yeah, you're not going to be having time to. But the idea of tracking all these transactions, and after 50 years, a family or second generation of kids giving it back to whoever you got it from, how's that going to go over? It turns out pretty sticky, It's a great idea. Maybe you remember, if any of you are familiar with the band U2, U2 and some other rock groups pressured our government in 2000 to cancel the foreign debts of third world countries or developing countries that were outstanding in terms of food costs. I think it was 580 million or 480 million as part of they use a language, as part of a jubilee at the millennium to help these countries get back on their feet. And kind of egalitarian, those who have share with those that are struggling. And it was canceled. But using that language of Jubilee, that idea of Jubilee to care for those who are most vulnerable, that idea of caring for those who are most vulnerable in the community is a very Levitical idea. So for all of its flaws and blemishes and sometimes weirdness and sometimes just, there are some really beautiful ideas in Leviticus as well. There's some ideas that are kind of rough and tumble as well. Stoning the blasphemer and getting them out there and making sure you take care of them. There's some tough stuff in Leviticus too.
All the blood all around.
Can you imagine? On the Day of Atonement, it must have been horrible.
Yeah. So, I mean,
A lot of people and a lot of
yeah.
animals.
So Day of Atonement, let's tackle Day of Atonement, which we call today Yom Kippur. Some differences, clearly, because we're not sacrificing thousands and thousands of animals for the community. But we also get something that we use today as a turn of phrase, scapegoating. So did you read about the scapegoat? All right. Does somebody feel like they've got at least a basic primer enough that you can kind of describe what the heck a scapegoat was in Leviticus times? How did that go down? And why are we scaping a goat? Anybody remember that? We got 2 goats.
But
I
yeah.
remember it, but I don't remember it enough to.
Well, the idea was 2 goats, and the priest, they did all their ritual with their hands on the head of the goat.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other goat took on those sins. The one was killed for the sacrifice, and geez, I'm sorry I did that. But the other one took on all the sins. I always think of the movie The Green Mile when I think about that. You swallowed up, placed upon them, whatever, and then the goat is released away from the tent of meeting, and it carries those sins away again so that the community can remain
Yeah,
clean.
out of,
out of the area.
yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah, the goat that is killed and its blood are for all the sins that have been named. I'm sorry I stole. I'm sorry he killed so-and-so's brother. All those are the named and confessed sins. The unconfessed sins, the sins that we might have unknowingly or that we didn't admit to, even though we know we did them, that goat is the goat that carries all the burdens. It gets the blame, takes all the blame of the community, rides off into the sunset. One's sacrificed to the God of Israel. One is sent out to Azael, who is, the evil spirits of the Canaanites. It's evil, the roaming evil in the wilderness, to have at the sins of the community that have been cast out. So blame game. They're going to take the blame for something that everybody else did. That's where this is the origin right here. So you learned something new, hopefully, of Leviticus. Dinner time conversation, you could say, yeah, scapegoat. You want to know what those origins are, or Jeopardy question? All right. Some unique things there. I want to touch on one other thing that will play heavily in the New Testament or in gospel readings. So remember, Jesus approaches the leper, touches the leper, proclaims the leper in one text clean. Then you have the 10 lepers in another in Matthew's gospel. If you had leprosy, you are cast out of the community. You're supposed to live alone. Did you read all those details? You have to wear a belt. You have to yell that you're unclean. You have to cover your face and your mouth in particular. And, warn everybody that you're coming. Seems kind of cruel on one level. But why do you think they had all those rules?
Very contagious.
Yeah, we don't know what we're dealing with. There's
COVID-like.
It reminded me a lot of COVID.
Yeah. So we don't know what we're dealing with. We don't know. There's lots of skin disease. Leprosy covers that word in the Bible, covers a lot of different ailments. And you see some of those described as, if it's got white dots or if it's pussing or, whatever it is. So we're going to remove it from the community until we determine it's safe to bring that person back into the community. Let's talk about food. Let's talk about clean and unclean animals. So we got all the business of split hooves versus chewing the cud versus not chewing the cud versus paws and claws. Why do you think we have all these different rules about you can't eat a lobster, but you can eat a fish? Why can you eat a grasshopper or a locust, but you can't eat a fly? Anybody have any ideas around that stuff?
Safety again, carrying disease, or, you're not eating things that are like roadkill, for example. Probably, it talks about animals who have been, torn apart by other animals or whatever, are not
Probably don't eat.
clean, so.
Okay, yeah. And
I'm not sure, like, some of the other choices seemed a little more arbitrary, but.
yeah, some of the Levitical menus seemed a little, confusing. But let's talk about locusts and grasshoppers to start. Why would those be a good thing to eat?
Supposedly they're high in protein.
Well, yeah.
And they aren't destroying your plants, so.
Aha. So they have some nutritional value, but they also threaten your crops. Go ahead and eat those things. Why can't I eat a pig, but I can eat a lamb or a goat?
They don't chew the cud.
Yes. All right, but in a more practical sense, why might they have chosen no pigs? Because, man, bacon and ham are good.
They're dirty.
They are dirty. They wallow.
They eat the same stuff we eat.
So you got potential trichinosis. They also wallow. They're muddy. But pigs eat the same thing people eat, root vegetables. So sheep and goats eat grass. If you're living off the land, danger of famine, danger of war, you want to be competing with something you're raising that you might not be able to eat because it's eating what you're eating. So yeah, go ahead and kill those things, but don't raise those. Those are unclean. Disease. So there might have been some practical reasons why pigs became the non-kosher food for the Israelites, not just because it didn't chew the cud, but it's possible that, yeah.
I already talked about that when we were in Israel.
Yeah,
He did talk about
yeah.
the reasons for this.
Yeah, there's specific health reasons, or health reasons they believed that, some of those beliefs translate to health things today, some of them not so much. Like, okay, you have all this stuff about menstruation, emissions of semen. I mean, woman's got to go out of the tent and, live outside. Can't sit on anything. I mean, all right,
I did notice that, like you said, there was two things, because one, if you have sex with a woman during a period, you have to be killed, and the other one is you're just unclean for a week.
Right.
There was a big difference there.
Slightly. Yeah, and then you also have, and I think there's a danger of misinterpretation here, but if a woman gives birth to a son versus a daughter, how long is she
Different.
unclean?
Twice as long.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Now, I've heard biblical commentators say, well, mother's bonding with her daughter more. Or,
When it says you're unclean, what does that,
you can't go into the tabernacle. You can't worship in the area that is holy. You can't embrace somebody else without making them unclean. I mean, you can, but then they're unclean until sunset and they ritually wash. You can't sit at a table without making everything unclean, and anybody who touches that, you can't use dishes, all those things.
some of this just sounds like germs, and
It had to do with blood too, right?
Mhm.
No, I mean, it was again an admission of blood that
Yep,
just don't touch that, because
right.
it's life and death. Oh,
This is why all those ritual baths,
Yes, the
they
mikvahs.
had, they're all over the place.
Yeah,
There just wasn't any water in them.
right.
Not
Yeah.
when we were there.
Well, yeah, but I'm like,
So a lot of that is
When the
Health.
insides come out on the outside.
a lot of it is purity, trying to be thinking about your purity, not just that you are or are not, but thinking about being pure, clean before God, clean before your neighbors. So all those ritual practices, but I don't want to sugarcoat it. I also think there's no question this is some patriarchal stuff here. women are not viewed the same as men. Sorry, ladies, I know you're the bulk of this class, but sons were the desired outcome. More often than not, women are seen as property. Because you see, like when we read in Exodus or Deuteronomy, I can't remember which of the 10 Commandments version, but it's, your neighbor shall not covet your property, your donkey, your wife, your fields. So there's
yet-
that. And yet.
Women are needed to give them sons to.
Correct. But there is going to be a cultural idea, very much like the Greeks had, that the woman was just kind of like the holding, the incubation site, and that the guy is really the progenitor of life. And we know that's not scientifically what's real or what we would believe today. But it helps reinforce, one's higher than the other. So you'll see a lot of that kind of language except we see exceptions. And I think we'll see that really strongly in the book of Numbers next week, where we have daughters inheriting land. And a big debate, can the women own the land? Well, yes, they can. So we'll get into that next week with Numbers. But
So there's still, they've left Egypt, now they're still wandering in the desert, right?
yeah,
So they haven't really set roots down anywhere. It's just like a whole herd of people and animals moving through the desert,
so
right?
that's
I mean-
the narrative that you have to take if Moses wrote all the Torah, because Moses is traveling.
Right.
But if you read this text, houses, fields, this is clearly happening after they've been exiled or sometime after they've settled in the promised land already. But if you're taking depends on how you're reading this part of the Bible and what your narrative is. If Moses has to have written it all because that's the tradition, and there are places that say Moses, wrote, gave us these words. In Deuteronomy, then they bury Moses. I don't know how he's writing about his burial, but it just depends on what, where you're coming down on that. So yes, they are traveling technically, and talking about how they're packing up the tabernacle to take it from place to place, where clearly they've probably already settled with it.
So at what point does a tabernacle become a synagogue? I mean, it's kind of the same thing, right?
Tabernacle, think tent of
Right.
meeting,
Right.
and the holiest of holies. The what makes the tabernacle holy is God's presence and the ark, the
Right.
commandments.
Okay. All right.
That's what makes the tabernacle the holy part of the tent of meeting. And when it becomes the temple, then it's the holiest of holies, and then you have the temple itself where people gather, the places of sacrifice, where the men gather, where the women gather, and where the Gentiles and foreigners gather in those tiers. We'll get to that when we talk about temple, and we'll make a little model. Sorry. Hello. All right. Now let's get to, any questions about any of that?
I have another
Yeah.
question.
Yeah.
In chapter 27, it says, if anyone makes a special vow to dedicate a person to the Lord by giving the equivalent value, set the value, blah, 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 blah. What does that mean? Dedicate a person. Who's getting the money?
Let me take a quick peek here. I'm going to have to come back to you on that. So dedicating of a person or an animal or a house or land to God, consecrating it, but to what end? I have to look at it more closely. Yeah, I can't handle that one on the fly. I'm not sure. It's a good question. I'll write it down. Okay. Other things we want to tackle. We want to get dicey? let's get dicey. Let's talk about the most controversial part of Leviticus today. So for the LGBTQ community, got Leviticus 20 and 19 or 18. So you have these laws about sexual purity and holiness. We get into Leviticus 18. So we have all these sexual laws. And we start, I'm just going to highlight because it ties it back into our Noah story in Genesis. Remember we talked about Noah and Ham uncovering the nakedness of his father. Well, here you have it. Verse 7, you shall not uncover the nakedness of your father, which is the nakedness of your mother. So that kind of gives us some light on understanding that Noah story a little bit better. But we've got all these sexual laws. Now, I'm just going to start off with a blanket statement and say to anybody who uses Leviticus to say, all right, this is against homosexuality. If you want to use the 6,000-year-old holiness code as a sexual ethic of your life and the purity ethic of your life, you got to take all of it.
That's right. Why that one verse? in
So
there?
we're going to talk about all of it and what it would look like to take it all and why these prohibitions are there, and talk about whether that's apples and apples today, because these are there's some very blunt statements. And so I want to start off with verse 11. You shall not uncover the nakedness of your father's wife's daughter. Okay, so if you have a dad but a different mom than your sister, you're not going to have sex with your sister. Now, we've read about somebody who's married his sister, his half-sister. Does that ring any bells to anybody? Her name is Sarah, and his name is Abraham. Okay. Then, verse 18, you shall not take a woman as a rival to her sister, uncovering her nakedness while her sister is still alive. Huh. We have another biblical patriarch named Jacob who has Leah and Rachel, who are definitely rivals because of what he's done. This, birthing competition. Okay. So we have two of the great patriarchs of Israel, and then we have these laws saying the relationships they have aren't holy.
But this is written after.
Which is what I always get from folks saying, well, okay, this is written after those guys, so it didn't affect those guys. But my question is, if God has given it to you, and God is making the laws as God wants it as purity, how can it be not good then and good now? God changed God's mind, or is it that's how it's supposed to be? I'm just making a point, just saying if you're taking it all, let's deal with all of it. Okay, let's read what's in there, because that's what's in there. Okay. All right. So here we are. We have in verse 19, shouldn't have incestual relationships with your kinsmen. Not sleeping with your sisters. Your kinsman is questionable. Is that cousins? Because we got a lot of cousins sleeping around here too. You shall not give your offerings as sacrifice to Molech, who's a Canaanite god, which means burning them alive. We got another problem here before we go on. Remember Isaac? All right, again, all right, yes, it's happening after. Again, we talked about, was Abram hearing God right, or was God asking him to give the thing that was absolutely vital for God's promise and God was asking him, again, I say that preaches really well, to give your most valuable, trust God with your most valuable thing, even if you're not sure how that's going to end up, preaches really well. But the reality, if you're Isaac and your dad's got a knife above you and you're not supposed to sacrifice your kids, that's going to play in a lot differently to that family dynamic,
But
okay?
this does say to Moloch and not to,
Right, not to Yahweh.
Yeah.
But later in text, it'll say you're not supposed to sacrifice your children like the Canaanites do, because that's abhorrent and abomination to God. Okay, digging in, 23, no sexual relations with animals, all right? Perversion. Then we have 24, do not defile yourself with, I'm sorry, I skipped over it. Number 22, verse 22. A man, you shall not lie with a male as you lie with a woman. It is an abomination. Okay, that's a text along with its counterpart a few chapters later that gets lifted out of Leviticus, really against LGBTQ community. So let's talk about a couple of layers to this. First, all these laws of sexual purity have one thing in common. Whether you're having sex with your sister, having sex with an animal, having sex male on male, it doesn't say anything about female on female here. What is the danger of all those sexual kind of interactions?
not making babies.
The vitality of a baby. If you're having sex with your sister, gene pool, I mean, they might not have been talking about genes, but the viability of a healthy baby is in jeopardy. If you're having sexual relations with an animal, yeah, male on male, you can't be fruitful and multiply, which is God's covenantal command. Populate the people. And I think it's telling that women are not mentioned here, female and female, because it's about the male's responsibility to populate. Now, I've heard a couple of other takes on this. One that I heard recently, within the last 5 years, which kind of made me think a little bit, was that this commentator was saying, of course you would not, I don't mean to offend anybody, but this is kind of verbatim what he said, you would not demean a man by sleeping with him as you would a woman, because of that differentiation of gender power, which was an interesting take.
But it kind of ties in well with Lot and the visitors to Sodom when they wanted to demean the men by having sex with them, and he offered his daughters. So
Yeah.
it fits that scenario of a power
And
dynamic.
again, that's why I go back, and I'm glad you brought up the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, because people want to make that a sexual ethic text about homosexuality relationship of, particularly about people who claim to be Christian and gay or lesbian, who are in a committed relationship to another. We should be talking about language of covenant and fidelity and faithfulness, heterosexual or homosexual, above and beyond using these texts that have more to do, particularly Sodom and Gomorrah. If you're going to use that as a sexual ethic, my God, yeah, rape my daughters instead of these guys. I mean, coercive sex, I don't care what orientation you are, is sinful. You're demeaning, you're abusing, you're taking advantage of somebody else. The other thing I would say about this is the language used for an abomination. I think this is really important because I've had over the years, I grew up in a church where, not in a UCC church, but in other church groups, and where I was taught, this is not something that is done. And I can't tell you how many gay or lesbian people, kids, young adults have come to me saying, God hates me. And that shame, that self-loathing, sorry, and it's this abomination word. That same language is used for if you eat at Red Lobster, if you eat shrimp, if you eat shellfish, if you wear polyester, that these things are not pure according to the priests of Israel. And I want to stress that. So it's a purity code. Tattoos. If you want to live by the purity code as the priests of ancient Israel understood it, then fine, do it all. Don't eat cheeseburgers because you can't eat a mother's baby with its milk or anything dairy. You know, don't eat shellfish because those are an abomination before God. Don't plant, if you're a gardener, don't plant peas with your carrots because that's an abomination before God. You can only have one seed and one kind. Everything has to be 100% pure. And so, do I think there's, you know, those are the things that I want you to hear beyond the text at a face value of the text. Can Christians today argue, and do they argue, that it's forbidden because of this text? Sure. Is it maybe one of the more clearer prohibitions on male sexual relationships? Sure. Is it apples to apples to two men who love each other, who are saying we're committed to each other before God and desire a relationship with God? I don't think so. I don't think so. I'm just telling you right now. I don't think it's the same thing. But it's in there. But again, so are all these other things. And I find a lot of cherry picking. I find a lot of people eating their cheeseburgers and enjoying their all-you-can-eat shrimp baskets and then bashing on a group of people. And if we're going to take Leviticus as a whole, these laws protected the most vulnerable. They tried to protect those who were hurt, who were, you know. But at the same time, yeah, you break a rule, you're going to die. So, you know, your kid mouths off, stone them. If somebody uses God's name in the wrong way, stone them.
But then thou shalt not kill.
So it's that's why I say Leviticus is a hard book to translate today, because if you're going to live in that kind of black and white world, there's not a lot of gray in Leviticus. And that's what makes it tough. It makes it a tough book to live by if you're going to take it literally. And you're going to live by every word as the Word of God today from Hebrew times. You know, nobody lives by it verbatim today. You're not sacrificing 2 turtle doves if you had a lustful thought. Well, Jesus made all that irrelevant. Well, that's what it says. So either do it or don't. But anyway, I just wanted to tackle that because it is the thing that, if I hear about Leviticus, it's mostly those 2 verses and nothing else. And there's a lot of beautiful things in Leviticus, and there's a lot of troubling things in Leviticus. I think you just gotta, I'm so sorry. You gotta weigh it all out and be prayerful about it, and you're walking with it. Thoughts, comments, disagreements, hit me. Go ahead. What we got?
Go ahead.
I was going to say, I thought it, in ways I felt like it was set forth this way to prove to the people that, you know, God is holy and God is 100% pure and God is, you know, your victor, and watch what I'm going to do to these Egyptians or whatever. It's like, you know, you're not convinced, now you will be, because of all these extreme actions and laws and
Yeah. Yeah, God's got to kind of wake the people up, right? Because they're not getting it. So you've got to up the volume somehow, up the game. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's something to that, Dave, for sure. Other thoughts are...
The thing that bothers me about Leviticus is the repetitive actions or rituals that, and I know it's ritual purity and holiness and all of that kind of stuff, that if you come and you sacrifice your grain offerings, your sin offerings, all those offerings, you're right with God for that moment. You go away and you live your life, and you got to come back and you do all that stuff again, and then you get right with God for that moment. But only one place, and I wish I had marked it, it's towards the end of it. those are just actions. There's never a transformation of the heart, except in one place where it talked about your uncircumcised hearts when they were breaking covenant. Because if the idea is, it's like that free ticket, you know, well, I've accepted Jesus as my Savior, therefore I have my free ticket, but and if I've done my animal sacrifice or sacrifice everything, I'm good to go for another whatever, but I don't necessarily have to change my behavior. I just got to come back and give another sacrifice. But the thing that bothered me about it was, what about the inner being, you know, other than that one verse of your uncircumcised heart? That's what needs the attention. But there didn't seem much push there.
Well, other comments, other thoughts?
I do like this one verse where God says, when an alien lives with you in your land, do not mistreat him. So, you know, that we could quote as all the people that are migrants coming in now.
Yeah. Yeah, I hope that you saw a lot of that egalitarian, you know, the gleaning, the care for the stranger or sojourner in your land. Why? Because you were a stranger and sojourner displaced in Egypt, so don't do it to somebody else. Yeah, you know, the things that strike me about Leviticus that make it kind of tough is I wonder, all right, these folks didn't have all the technology and all the doodads that we have, but they also had a lot of time on their hands outside of working. I mean, they had to work hard, but they got a lot of like kind of free time on their hand to get in kind of some mischief. How do they have any animals left at all? Because I'm thinking, you know, if you're being honest about the sins you're committing, you're being broke pretty quick.
How many bulls do these people have?
Exactly.
How many people knew?
And how would you remember?
Right.
Yeah, that's the other thing. I mean, I sometimes we have youth group and we have games or we have instructions on what the kids are supposed to do. And I can't remember how many times I got to re-explain the rules of the games. I mean, if you're talking about a whole 12 tribes of thousands and thousands of people, how do you continue to convey all these rules without the people forgetting exactly how many, you know, Hail Marys and Rosaries, you know, how many do I have to say for this one? You know, it just seems like a lot of red tape to kind of wade through and remember, especially if you're illiterate. And you just got to remember what the priest told you at the big assembly where you might be in the back, no amphitheater, no microphone, so. You know.
Then if it was word of mouth, the next person could have made the interpretation of a different law.
Yeah, oh, you got to give
Like the telephone.
10 bulls.
You
Yeah.
have to repeat it over and over, just like
Yeah.
You can sure see where the indulgences came from.
Sorry,
The question was,
apologies.
is this recorded anywhere else, like you know, there's Gilgamesh and all of that. Are there any stories like among other peoples that would be similar to the
Yeah, there are other holiness
holy laws?
codes. Yeah, Babylonians have a holiness code. The Assyrians have a holiness code. The Arcadians have a holiness code. So yeah, the law of Hammurabi, the law code of Hammurabi, a lot of similar things. If you steal X, you get a hand cut off. If if your bull gores somebody, you've got to pay restitution with a bull and some money. So yeah, those ancient Sumerian law codes predate Leviticus. And so there's also a strong possibility that, theology doesn't happen in a vacuum. The Egyptians influenced the Hebrew people as they're traveling, Book of the Dead, Book of Life. The Canaanites influenced them. So yeah, there's some of that is, and one of the ways that we can really tell that is, like in the book of Numbers, it describes God coming in the clouds, riding the clouds, blessing the rains. Those are all direct quotes from the Canaanite god Baal, who's a god of fertility, god of thunder and lightning. And so they're taking those descriptions, and actually the name El Shaddai, Elohim, that El is a Canaanite term for the gods. And the Hebrew people have lifted it and use it as an adjective to describe Yahweh. So yeah, there are definitely influences. This is, the priests aren't just making this up with no influence or impact from anybody else, any other cultures around them. Great question.
Is there any evidence of the Exodus besides the Bible?
I want to say yes, but not as thin. It's thin. And I think Pastor Michelle would debate that. I've been to Egypt, and there are mention of the Hebrew slaves, and they're mentioned that they're gone now. How they're gone is not mentioned. But there is mention of Hebrew slaves, or they go by the goyim, people of the dirt. But they're enslaved, and they are building the projects that the book of Exodus describes. Now, are those the same people? Now, some people would argue, no, they're not the same people. There's no evidence that this actually really happened. I would argue that's one of the main threads of the Hebrew Bible, and it's a pretty darn important identity that I think it's probably pretty strong. They didn't make it up, but that's just me. Yeah. Good questions, hardballs. Anything else? Well, then, till next week, when we delve into the book of Numbers, also known as the book of Wanderings in Hebrew. It is another fun book. Pay special attention to the red heifer, just because it's fun to say, and the test for adultery. Write some questions about the test for adultery, because actually it's going to come off as very barbaric. I'm going to argue that it's actually a woman's rights, an early woman's rights advocacy in the Old Testament, and we'll go from there. The red heifer, the red heifer, red cow, special red cow, and the sweeping of the dust of the temple floor and drinking it. Test of adultery.